the birth of Israel was effectively something that Labor was a midwife to, and it's an extremely proud part of our tradition. Clive Evatt, was the chairman of the ad hoc committee that actively, vigorously and successfully steered through that committee the support for the partition resolution, the partition plan, to create the original two-state concept, which we should have actually had back in 1947 had Israel's neighbours accepted it at that time. But Doc Evatt put an enormous amount of work into that and was widely acknowledged as having been someone who made, and I quote, a very vital contribution to the final result. And in fact, Michael Comey, Israel's rep to the UN at the time, praised Evatt for his masterly handling of the ad hoc committee. Now, it didn't end there because it had to then get steered through the General Assembly. And of course, Doc Evatt ended up becoming the initial president of the General Assembly. And he masterfully, again, put enormous effort into ensuring that that vote passed in the General Assembly. And of course, Australia was one of the very first countries to vote in favour of it, and is well remembered in Israel for that purpose. Now, these are the existential issues about the creation of the State of Israel. This is where it really counts. And it's important to note that in later years, the President of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, hailed Evatt for having played, and I quote, a momentous role in all the processes which culminated in the birth of Israel. And in 1965, the Australian Jewish News eulogised him as the man who piloted the establishment of Israel through the UN in 1948. But at both of those steps, at the partition plan process, the navigating of that through the ad hoc committee and the General Assembly process, and then later also in relation to the recognition of Israel, its admission to the UN, every single step of that way, the coalition government of the day bitterly opposed every step that Labor made in that direction. And the Liberal country parties that were in coalition as a federal opposition at that time were incredibly anti-Israel. And they were just slavishly following the British policy at the time, and they severely criticised our Chifley-Evatt government support for that process. And in fact, they made some outrageous comments, which you can check the Hansard for. One of them was an outright anti-Semitic statement that the UN decision, they claimed, resulted from political pressure by American Jews and was thus illegitimate. Such a statement today would be roundly condemned, but that's the statement they made at the time. The opposition also criticised the raising of funds by the Jewish community here, implying that it had been done under duress and could be used for anti-British purposes in Palestine. And it was one of the reasons why the Jewish youth paper, Banativ at the time, in praising Australia, which they said, unlike Britain, is not lending her support to any plan of settlement which gives territorial concessions in Israel to foreign invaders, Banativ also criticised members of the opposition who have attacked Dr Evatt for failing to follow slavishly the anti-Israel line adopted by Britain. So these were the realities of the time. Now, the community in Australia was very much supportive of the recognition of Israel and its submission to the UN, particularly in those recognition arguments and debates that were going on, that, as I say, the opposition at the time, the coalition opposed. There was leaflets supported by the trade union leaders, academics and clergymen, published by the historian Brian Fitzpatrick in July 1948, calling on the government to recognise Israel. And of course, on the 29th of January 1949, the Chifley government announced that the Australian government had decided to give full recognition to the Jewish state of Israel and regarded the nation of Israel as, I quote, a force of special value in the world community. That's the voice of Chifley. And one of the reasons why Chifley and Evatt were so keen to do this was because it was in very recent memory the support that the Jewish community of Israel had given to our soldiers, including both of my grandfathers at the time, actually, which I'm extremely grateful for, considering the sufferings they later went through in the war, the fight against the Japanese. But that community provided extensive welfare arrangements and looked after our troops with great care. And of course, Chifley and Evatt were also aware that the leadership of the Palestinians, who let their people down severely at the time, collaborated closely with the Nazis. Haj Amin al-Husseini, one of their leaders, was in Germany helping to orchestrate the Holocaust at the time and recruiting for the SS. So they were well aware of that, and was one of the reasons why their attitude was shaped in the way it was. But again, Britain opposed the de jure recognition of Israel, and the federal opposition at the time supported Britain in vehemently criticising the Chifley government. As I said, the Labor government also supported Israel's admission to the United Nations, despite, again, opposition by Britain and the coalition here, and that took place on the 11th of May 1949, again through the fantastic efforts, the vigorous efforts of Doc Evatt, who became President of the General Assembly on the 21st of September 1948. And Foreign Minister of Israel, Moshe Sharett, when he got up to make his acceptance speech of that recognition, thanked Doc Evatt and described him as one of the foremost personalities responsible for the birth of Israel, and presented him with a certificate of the Jewish National Fund in recognition of his services to Israel. And immediately after that, of course, they exchanged diplomatic missions. So that was a proud tradition, a proud process that had begun in 1947 and followed right through to the final recognition and admission of Israel to the UN. Now, as being one of the first countries to do that, again, the Jewish community here was quite concerned about the opposition positions on this issue, and that Banativ youth magazine that I referred to were deeply concerned in the 1949 elections about what the policy would become if the coalition was to win. And they called on their readership to vote for the Labor government, which, and I quote, consistently supported the cause of Israel, Jewry and the UN. And they warned that a Liberal government would result in the growing tide of anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist feeling being heard more loudly in Parliament, but this time from the government benches. Now, those I would describe as the bad old days. Since then, and look, you know, we should freely admit periods of Labor policy that we need to admit to honestly about, such as our support for the White Australia policy over time. So it's important to recognise, you know, bad parts of our history. That was a bad time. I think members of the coalition will recognise that their position in those days was wrong. And it's good to see that, so from the mid-50s onward, there was this deep and abiding bipartisanship, and we all know the stories, and of course Bob Hawke's efforts and the like, in getting Soviet Jewry out, supporting Israel. And where we are today, of course, is moving the peace process forward. So what we should be doing is looking for ways to make that two-state solution happen, to deliver the final piece of this story. And that's why we had issues with this decision about the embassy move. It was a clumsy attempt to intervene in the region, in the issue, in the process for the purposes of a by-election. And it was done not in consultation with the quartet or the stakeholders or consultation with the parties involved. And with a major diplomatic step like that, you always use it. You use it in the process. So we could have, say, gone to Israel and said, look, you know, we'd love to do this, but we'd like to see more action on dismantling illegal outposts. Could have gone to the Palestinians and said, look, you know, we want to do this, but, you know, if you, for example, would stop what's going on in the Gaza Strip with Hamas and its brutal treatment of gays and lesbians and women and outlawing of free trade unionism, etc., you know, we could have said, okay, you know, we'll only do this in the context of a recognition of East Jerusalem as well. Those are the kinds of things you could have worked through, which is what I believe the Trump administration is doing at the present time. But no, it was this ham-fisted, stumble-bum approach to getting involved in the intricate and difficult politics of the Middle East. So I'd say let's not try and play politics with this. We need to retain a bipartisan approach to this issue, to carefully craft our way through to diplomacy, to get to that two-state solution that we really would like to see, and in a way that helps the Palestinians build the mechanisms of a state and also encourages them down the path of a democratic, secular state that respects human rights. And that is the objective of